Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As promised, I brought something in for show and tell today. Talking about Vietnam War, so I thought I'd bring in an authentic homemade Viet Cong rifle. This was captured in 1962. The barrel, Viet Cong rifle. Like I said, it's homemade. The barrel is made out of plumbing pipe. Yeah. How many people want to put a full charge in this and pull the trigger? It's a cobbled together lock mechanism from a couple different kind of guns. And the stock general consensus is it's from an old French rifle. So this is some of the weaponry that they were carrying. Huh? Well, what does it shoot? Damn near any ammunition you can stuff down it. Yeah, what they would do, they would take captured American ammunition, because obviously this barrel is pretty wide. Yeah, but what they would do is take like a 5.6 or something like that, and wrap wire around it so it would fit down here. So it'd be a tighter fit. And you could always tell when they were shooting these things, because after they pulled the trigger and the bullet went out, the wire started unraveling. And you could hear it, and you go, woo, 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 woo. And these things obviously were accurate as hell. Scare the crap out of you. Huh?
After it got hot.
Yeah, I have no idea if the guy this was taken from ever fired it. For his sake, I hope he didn't. But yeah, this would have been, this was Viet Cong. It was taken in 1962 by my late father-in-law, actually. It doesn't have a firing pin in it, though. I'll pass it around. The reason is because when my father-in-law brought it home, he initially gave it to my brother-in-law, and he knew that he would run right out and try and shoot it, so he made sure he could. And this is the kind of hat a lot of Viet Cong wore. If they weren't wearing the traditional, good morning, passing the Viet Cong rifle around. But if they weren't wearing the traditional straw hat that you see even today, very common over there, they were wearing something like this. This was a typical Viet Cong militia hat. Boy Scout. Actually, when you're out there, something like that's a hell of a lot more comfortable. Try to run around there in a helmet, die heat stroke. Can you imagine trying to aim that thing too? Now, on Monday, I left you with a rather colorful quote from an American advisor, Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, on the general performance of ARVN. Remember, I was talking about the Battle of Oc Bac. And his frustrations that he expressed to the Pentagon were very typical for most of the American advisors, both military and civilian. We were becoming increasingly frustrated with both the corruption and incompetence in the South Vietnamese government and in their military, in ARVN. Diem was acting pretty much like a dictator. He was suppressing basic civil rights like freedom of speech. He was imprisoning his would-be enemies without trial or even charging them. He was using torture. And by the way, we tolerated all this as long as we could put a public facade on his government, as long as we could act like it was a democratically elected government. Kennedy had tried many things to help reform Ziem's government and Vietnam. Got a long slide up here, sorry. One of them was the so-called strategic Hamlet. The idea was to build fortified villages. And then you could use local militia units to defend them from the Viet Cong. But as usual, with all the corruption in the government, a lot of the construction supplies we're sending over there to build these things end up on the black market. Secondly, Diem doesn't give the peasants a choice to leave their traditional village and go to one of these new strategic hamlets, these fortified villages. He orders them to go and uses the army to force them. Well, by the way, they have to help build the strategic hamlet while they're still trying to farm and make a living. You have to understand something about the Buddhist culture. It's very rooted in their ancestors. Their ancestors are considered sacred. And if you visit Vietnam, you notice out in the rice fields, there's a lot of small tombs. That's traditionally where the family tomb is, buried on the family property. Some of these families have been on the same land for a couple of 100 years. And now Diem is coming along and uprooting them without their permission. You throw in the corruption and the coercion, and these things help turn the people against his government. And this is just one example, by the way. Oh, thank you. This is an aerial view of one of them. The biggest problem he's going to have, though, is with the Buddhist majority. As I pointed out, Diem tends to suppress the Buddhists, especially in favor of his co-religionists. Yeah. He had been in an ongoing battle with some of the Buddhist leaders for a couple of years. As I pointed out, he considered them backward and was condescending to them. On the 8th of May, 1963, despite a ban on celebrating the Buddha's birthday, obviously the single biggest holiday among Buddhists, they celebrate anyway. He sends in troops, there are riots, and numerous people are killed. Diem imposes martial law, raids a lot of the pagodas, arrests hundreds of the priests. Now, Buddhist monks actually tend to be very political, despite the shaved head and eyebrows and saffron robes and the humble attitude. They're actually very politically astute. And they often have played a hand traditionally in Vietnamese politics. By the way, I don't have a picture of it here, but a lot of their protests, their signs are in English. So who are they really appealing to? Little hint, the average Vietnamese doesn't speak English. On the 11th of June, a senior monk, Thich Quang Duc, he had been a monk since he was 12 years old, commits a traditional Buddhist act of protest. Here's some acolytes in Monk Spring. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You missed the Viet Cong rifle. Here's a Viet Cong homemade rifle. You guys want to look at it real quick. This Thich Quang Duc, he pulled into a intersection in Saigon, sat calmly in the lotus position, as his fellow monks doused him in gasoline. This is the result. He set himself on fire to protest Ziem's government. And several other monks will, in the next ensuing year or so, will follow his example. To other Buddhists, this is a call to arms, to oppose Ziem's government. And it results in, yes, more numerous pagoda raids and hundreds more arrested. The corruption, the favoritism, the suppression of the Buddhist doesn't play well with a lot of Ziem's own top generals. Many of them are against the corruption, many of them are against favoritism, and they began to plot a coup against him. By the way, that's pretty typical in Southeast Asia in this period. They contact the US government to see if we would support the overthrow of Ziem. And the Kennedy administration tried for over a year to get Ziem to institute reforms, and he refused to do it. So in the summer of 1963, the Kennedy administration let the generals know they would support a coup. And in fact, through an intermediary, we gave them $10,000 to help fund it. Then they got cold feet, backed out on us. Finally, in the late fall, after another series of riots and suppressions, they decided to go ahead with it. And the coup began on the night of the 1st of November, 1963. Ziem became aware of it, and he and his brother Nu fled to St. Xavier Catholic Church in the Cholon district of Saigon. Cholon is the traditionally Catholic section of Saigon. Sorry, I'm jumping around between a couple of different lectures that I got more to show you. No, that's not this one. Sorry, I had some pictures, but I can't find them. They seek refuge in the Catholic Church there. They contact the generals. This was not the first attempt to overthrow Ziem. And they arranged basically for his safe conduct. He would be turned over to American authorities and then given safe conduct to another country, which we were trying to arrange. you know anything about Vietnamese politics, it's considered unwise to leave ex-leaders lying around. Because ex-leaders often want to be, again, the future leader. So the minute Diem and New got into the armored personnel carrier that was supposed to take them into exile, a Vietnamese officer put 2 bullets in the back of their heads. By the way, that shocked Kennedy and the Americans because we were rather naive and didn't think they would do anything like that. Far from stabilizing the government, it led to a period of tremendous instability. One of the coupsters, one of the ARVN generals, took over, Dong Van Minh, and he was often known by his nickname of Big Minh. You know why he was called that? Because he was a big guy. That's what he was 6 foot tall. And if you know anything about Vietnam, that would pretty much make him the center of the basketball team. They average about 5'2", 105 pounds. One of the reasons I like going over there is I'm tall over there. So Big Minh was big for Vietnamese. He's only going to last a few months. In fact, by the end of 1964, only 13 months, there have been 7 regime changes. Different generals keep overthrowing other generals. In fact, Minh will come back to power for a while and get overthrown again. So far from stabilizing the Vietnamese government, it led to this period of chaos. Now, Kennedy isn't going to have a lot of time to deal with that. When the coup occurs and Diem is executed, Kennedy was planning a trip to Dallas. He was going down to try and mend political fences with some of the Southern Democrats. Kennedy, his first couple of years, had been relatively successful, even though domestic issues didn't figure prominently in his administration. The ones that had cropped up, he had done well at. He had inherited a weak economy, and as he begins to pump money into the government, begins a lot of construction projects, infrastructure projects, and the economy takes off. The gross domestic product goes from an average of 2.2% in the 1950s to over 5.5% in the 1960s. It'll lead to a booming economy up through 1969. That's when the impact of the Vietnam War starts eroding the economy. Unemployment will remain low, normally under 2%. And inflation only about 1% a year. So Kennedy actually does a great job with the economy. The area, though, that he really has problems with, obviously, is civil rights. As I pointed out the other day, he fails to get his Civil Rights Act passed by Congress. One reason was Southern opposition. The other reason, though, is for all of Kennedy's skills, he was not particularly adept at dealing with Congress, even though he had been a member of both the House and Senate. He really didn't know the ins and outs of how to get legislation through Congress. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, is the past master at it. If Johnson wants something passed, he figures out a way to get it through Congress. Kennedy doesn't have that skill. On top of that, his civil rights advocacy is beginning to cause defections in the lower South. A lot of the conservative Democrats are thinking about changing party. You have a growing rift within the Democratic Party. The West and the Northeast is becoming increasingly liberal, and that's reflected in the party. The South has remained rather conservative. So the conservative Southern Democrats really don't fit all that well now in with the National Party. And they're infuriated over civil rights. So they're beginning to defect to the Republican Party. Kennedy wants to go to Texas and meet with the then Democratic governor, John Connally. He's trying to convince Connally not to switch parties. And Connally eventually will. So will Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, and several other highly conservative Southern Democrats. Kennedy has his eye on the upcoming election. And he believes he needs the support of the Southern Democrats to get reelected, despite the fact he's done a pretty good job so far. So he plans to visit Dallas on the 21st of November, roughly 3 weeks after Zien's assassination. He doesn't realize an assassin is waiting for him. Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was a committed communist, hated the U.S., and had, quote, defected to the Soviet Union. And I put defect in quotes because he was no government official, he wasn't in the military, he was a private citizen. If he wanted to move there, that was his business, quite frankly. There was no law against it. But he's often listed as a, quote, defector, but he isn't. Well, when he got over there, he discovered the Soviet Union wasn't exactly a paradise, did get married, but quickly became dissatisfied with living in the Soviet Union as he had in the United States. So he moved back to the US. But he continued to be a pain in the butt. He was a strong advocate for Castro in Cuba, and he was on basically the FBI's watch list. Anytime a president goes to a city, the FBI has a watch list of people that they want to know where they're at when the president is in that town. And if the person is considered dangerous enough, they will be called in for, quote, questioning for a few hours. Basically detain them so they can't cause any trouble. Now I want to point out that Oswald was on the FBI watch list. Now when he moved back, he eventually settled in Dallas. And in early October, long before Kennedy had actually planned or announced his trip to Dallas, Oswald got a job at the Texas Book Depository. That's where they stored all the textbooks for Dallas. And that's going to be a so-called shooter's nest. The 6th floor, the Texas Book Depository. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, at 11:30 here in the morning, Oswald fires 3 shots in Labor Day. One hits Governor Connally, who is seriously wounded, but he does survive. And another hits President Kennedy in the head. He's rushed to a Dallas hospital. But around 1 p.m., he's pronounced dead. He becomes the 4th president in American history to be assassinated. And it's one of those events that if you were alive back then, you never forget it. I was a little kid. I was in the 2nd grade. But I will never forget that day. I'll never forget the nun coming into our classroom to announce that school was canceled because the president had just been shot and killed. So it's one of those things you don't forget. Most of you folks, you're too old to remember 9/11, aren't you?
I was working, I remember it popped on TV. I remember watching when
Yeah, we're relative old timers compared to
we were
those.
watching, and we're like, whoa, things have been set on it.
Yeah, I was sitting in my doctor's office for a routine appointment watching the TV, and it came on. Everybody was shocked. What else are you gonna do that day? But most of you folks probably don't remember that. So I really hope you never have that kind of event in your life that sears your memory like that. I've had 3 of them, that, Challenger, and 9/11.
It's great doing challenge. We might have been watching that in class.
I was in graduate school. Yeah, I was in the office with a bunch of other graduate students, and another one came in and said, "You won't believe it, Challenger just exploded." And none of us believed him because he was a wise guy at first. It was a shock. Oswald, after shooting a Dallas policeman, I might add, and killing him, was finally arrested. He doesn't live that much longer. On the 24th of November, a rabid Kennedy fan named Jack Ruby shot and killed him as he was being transferred from the Dallas police station into federal custody. And despite all the conspiracy theories, by the way, and there's been a library full of them all over the years, but none of them are based on a single shred of verifiable evidence. Despite all the claims that the CIA did it, the Cubans did it, Johnson did it, 7 Munchkins did it, I don't know. I just made that one up, but I can make a book out of that problem. There's no evidence for any of that.
I think I've read in some places, about grassy knoll, and they don't even, they just say it's where it was shot.
Yeah, the so-called grassy knoll
Somebody here did it.
and the suspicious figures on it.
That's a big one.
Yeah, the suspicious figures, the so-called grassy knoll was a common hangout for homeless people. That would be like saying you saw, quote, suspicious people down and over the Rhine. Okay? I mean, all these theories, when you really look at the evidence, breaks down. By the way, just to, oops, I got the wrong one up here today. Here's Kennedy, and his wife Jackie in the car. Here's the Texas State Book Depository. And this arrow is where Kennedy's limousine was when he was shot. And here's the filthy murderer. And here he is getting shot. By the way, don't have to worry about Oswald showing up as an ID. I will never glorify assassins. They will never be on the exam or something like that. And just for fun, The Onion made a little bit of fun of all the Kennedy assassination theories. So this is theirs. CIA, Mafia, Castro, LBJ, the Teamsters, and the Freemasons all shot him 129 times from 43 different angles. Of course, none of that is true. Now that makes his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, president of the United States. And he was sworn in on Air Force One with a very shocked and stunned Jacqueline Kennedy by his side. Can't tell it from this photograph, but she's still got some of John's brains and blood on her coat. She didn't want to be there. Johnson insisted because he wanted sort of the imprint of legitimacy. And by the way, he was by no means cruel to Jackie and all that. He was extremely kind and solicitous after the assassination, but he wanted her there. You can actually stand in that exact spot. That Air Force One is now on display right up the road at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the museum. And you can tour the plane, see how presidents used to fly, and pretty much stand in that exact spot. So, a little bit of history for you there. So Lyndon, oh, by the way, the Warren Commission that was charged with investigating the assassination reported out that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. And a lot of people claim there was a cover-up with the Warren Commission, and they were right. But it wasn't the kind they thought. One of the commission members was secretly leaking information to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. You see, if anybody was culpable, if anybody should have been blamed for this, it was Hoover. He dropped the ball. What the hell was somebody like Oswald doing, running around with no supervision that day? He should have been being watched or detained. The spy on the Warren Commission that was feeding information to Hoover to protect him and the FBI was future President Gerald R. Ford, guy that would assume office after Richard Nixon resigns in disgrace. So if you're looking for a cover-up, that's it. Now, Lyndon Johnson is going to be somewhat different than John F. Kennedy as president. Up to their death. Johnson was born into a political family like Kennedy in Stonewall, Texas. Both his father and his grandfather had served in the Texas legislature. The family owned a lot of land, but it was largely scrub land. So the family was not particularly wealthy. They were well respected, had a nice lineage, all that. But actually they were rather modest in income. Johnson was not wealthy as a child by any means. In fact, his boyhood home was basically a big ranch type house. No mansion or anything like that. He was initially a teacher by occupation. He was always a little touchy about where he went to school. He was proud of it. But keep in mind, you know, when you're running in those kind of circles, you're dealing with people that have degrees from Harvard and Yale, you know, Stanford, Northwestern. Johnson was addressing his cabinet one day and remarked, "I see all of America's greatest educational institutions represented here. Harvard, Yale, Southwest Texas State Teachers College, where he got his degree. He became enamored with Roosevelt and the New Deal, fired up by the idealism. So he entered politics, first as a congressional aide, then being director for the Texas National Youth Administration under the New Deal, then congressman, then senator. And as senator, he became one of the most powerful people in the country, Senate Majority Leader. Arguably next to the president, that's probably the most single powerful position in the government. Remember, the vice president really can't do squat. They're an insurance policy. He gave all that up to become Kennedy's running mate. And it paid off, but not in the way he expected it to. He thought it would lead to the presidency, but not in 1963. He was vulgar, vain, earthy, could be abusive at times, had been somewhat corrupt in Texas politics. He was never money corrupt. It was never money that influenced Johnson. And calling a Texas politician from the 30s, 40s, early 50s corrupt is sort of being redundant. They were all particularly adept at rigging elections and things like that. He won the Texas primary for senator, the Democratic primary, by 100 votes. And both sides, if you looked at the voting rolls later on, you'd find that this is how patriotic the good citizens of Texas are. Thousands of dead Texans voted in that election. We can't get live Americans to vote. Here, dead ones are voting back then. This is in, by the way, early 1950s, and things changed radically after that. But he also picked up the nickname Landslide Lyndon because of that. So he had his faults, trust me. He was egocentric and arrogant. Kennedy had sent him to Vietnam on a fact-finding mission when he was vice president. And when Johnson was leaving Saigon, he went out to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, this huge sprawling base the Americans had there, and he got on the wrong helicopter. He was going to flying out to his plane. And the young pilot, kind of sheepishly, turned to him and said, "Mr. Vice President, this isn't your helicopter." And Johnson replied, "Son, they're all my goddamn helicopters. Now you fly this thing." Give you an idea what Johnson was like. And by the way, the helicopter pilot took off dutifully and flew into his plane. Johnson also had a lot of extremely good qualities as well. He truly cared about the American public. He was efficient. He was loyal. Kennedy couldn't have asked for a more loyal vice president. And he was trustworthy. If he gave you his word on something, he kept it. Kennedy, John Kennedy anyway, liked him and trusted him. He was one of his most senior and closest advisors, which is ironic because as much as John and Lyndon liked each other and respected each other, Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, couldn't stand each other. They hated each other's guts. And that would later affected the Democratic Party in the election of 1968, among other things. Johnson had a vision for America. He understood that we were the wealthiest, most prosperous nation on earth. That we could do something that had largely eluded the grasp of earlier generations. We could use America's tremendous wealth to eradicate poverty and inequality in America. Truly give everybody a balanced playing field. Give everybody a decent chance at life. Enough food to eat, a roof over their head, and education and opportunity. Johnson would label this his, quote, great society. It was a term that was actually coined back in the early 1900s by philosopher Graham Greene. But it fits Johnson extremely well. He wants to use government basically to address all the inequities in American life. In many ways, it's Johnson's version of the New Deal. He had always been inspired, remember, by FDR and the New Deal, and in many ways, this was his way of replicating it. Except this time, there's no economic crisis, there's economic prosperity. We have something to work with. Now, one of the major components of Johnson's Great Society is going to be the Civil Rights Movement. And in the eyes of many African American leaders, Johnson becomes an unlikely champion. He's a Southern Democrat. Traditionally, they hadn't been particularly kind or sympathetic to the Civil Rights Movement. Johnson was different. If you look at his voting record in the House and Senate, when it comes to civil rights, Johnson had a very liberal record. Nationally, it would probably be about moderate liberal. But compared to most Southern senators, it was decidedly liberal when it came to civil rights. But the black community was still leery about him when he became president. But Johnson is going to probably do more for civil rights in the African American community than any president before him in the 20th century. To begin with, he will name the first African American to a presidential cabinet. Remember FDR's black cabinet, his group of advisors? I mentioned a young economist, Robert C. Weaver. Well, Dr. Weaver becomes the first African American to serve as a cabinet secretary. He will become head of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. He'll also appoint the first African American to the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. He's appointed in October of 1967. Where have you heard that name before?
No. Right?
Yeah, he was the head,
NAACP.
the lead counsel for the NAACP, thank you. He's the guy that argued the Brown versus Board case. And now he's on the Supreme Court. Johnson also reintroduces Kennedy's civil rights legislation to Congress. And unlike Kennedy, Johnson will get it through. To begin with, he knows how to either bribe, flatter, or threaten better than almost anyone. It's known as the Lyndon treatment. Johnson was a pretty big guy. He'd call you to the White House. And if he was trying to flatter you, you know, he'd be the nicest, friendliest guy in the world. He was trying to intimidate you. He could look like Darth Vader on a bad day. And it usually ended with him throwing one of his big lanky arms around you and walking you around the Oval Office going, now, you know what I'm talking about? You know what I want you to do here? So a lot of people either came out very flattered or scared for their life. But he usually got what he wanted. He got one senator to vote for the Civil Rights Act, a married senator, by calling him at his girlfriend's house. Now, what subtle message is Johnson trying to send to this individual? Seriously, what subtle message? I know about the girlfriend. If you don't vote for this, the wife's going to find out. It's not that subtle, is it, huh? By the way, the guy switched his vote. So by hook or crook, Johnson's going to get the Civil Rights Act passed. Now, while this is winding its way through the hallowed halls of Congress, that summer, June '64, the so-called Freedom Summer begins. So I pointed out earlier, the Kennedy administration, and now the Johnson administration, was pursuing a policy of aiding the civil rights movement, but trying to steer them away from direct action. And the so-called Freedom Summer is a classic example of that. They fund most of the major organizations, SNCC, CORE, NAACP, to send volunteers into the South to conduct voter education programs, literacy schools, voter registration. A lot like the earlier VEP I mentioned, except that had been largely focused on Mississippi. Freedom Summer is going to be throughout the South, but again, it's also going to have somewhat of a focus on Alabama and Mississippi. Those were probably the two worst states. And some of the activists plan on engaging in direct action, demonstrations and boycotts and that. But the Johnson administration okayed that in advance. The volunteers, both black and white, it was mixed, received training before they went down south. You never guess where they received their training. It wasn't UC, but it was a college not far from here. Miami University. That's where the activists trained before they went down south for the Freedom Summer. And there were several reasons. One, Miami's got plenty of room. It could easily accommodate several thousand activists that they were training. Secondly, the school had a very liberal tradition. And third, it was located not real close, but relatively close to the relatively brand new I-75. So transportation was important. It's going to turn out violently, unfortunately. During the Freedom Summer, the segregationists respond by bombing the headquarters of 4 different civil rights organizations in Mississippi. They burn half a dozen black churches, and black churches are often a target because they're usually centers of organization for local movements and all that. There's harassment, arrests, beatings, and even murder. On the 15th of June, 3 activists disappear in Mississippi. 2 Northern Whites, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, and an African American from Mississippi, James Chaney. They disappeared after having been arrested and detained by the Neshoba County Sheriff. Now, of course, Mississippi declined to take any action. So Johnson, on a legal pretext, the fact that 2 of the individuals were not from Mississippi and they feared kidnapping, which would be a federal offense, Johnson uses this to send in thousands of federal workers to look for the 3 missing civil rights activists. He even activates several thousand Navy reservists. Unfortunately, they're going to find the 3 missing young men on the 4th of August, buried in an earthen dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi. All 3 had been beaten and shot. Now, eventually, and due to the determination of the Johnson administration, and again, you couldn't get any justice in Mississippi, period. But the federal government will eventually charge Lawrence Rainey, the sheriff, his deputy, Cecil Price, and 5 others, all members of the Ku Klux Klan, will be convicted in federal court on charges relating to the murder of these 3 young men. And they will serve prison sentences from anywhere from 3 to 10 years. Now, the death of the 3 young workers is going to have a profound effect a couple of different ways. One, it's going to reaffirm Johnson's support for the civil rights movement. But it's also going to help embitter and disaffect many of the younger activists, especially the activists from SNCC and CORE. They're tired of getting beaten up. They're tired of being thrown in jail. They're getting frustrated with nonviolence. They don't think, as much as Johnson has done, they don't think the government's doing enough. So you begin to see a split in the civil rights movement. And the split's going to become permanent eventually over the Vietnam War. That's going to become a major issue. Now, that summer, the Senate finally passes the Civil Rights Act, 73-27, and Johnson signs it into law on the 2nd of July, 1964. Civil Rights Act outlaws segregation in public accommodations, but it says nothing about voting rights. So that will take another act by the government, proposed by Johnson, in 1965, the Federal Voting Rights Act. And to top off a good year for the civil rights movement, that year, the 24th Amendment, outlawing poll taxes, is ratified. And in December, Dr. King is awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. So it looks like Johnson's Great Society is getting off to a good start. And on Friday, we'll look at the Great Society and the horror of Vietnam. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.